Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador. Now Sony have not asked me to make this video, they've had no input in what I say in this video and they haven't seen this video prior to publication. My main aim for making these videos is to give you information so you can make an informed purchasing decision. Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the Sony A1M2 Mark II camera review. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Now I'd like to thank Dorna for making a media pass available so I could shoot this year's Australian MotoGP with the A1M Mark II pre-production camera. Now why use a Sony A1 or A1M2 to cover an event like this? Simply, it's the ability to capture 30 frames per second with zero blackout in the viewfinder. Now I'm panning exceptionally rapidly because the bikes are moving at very close range to me in excess of 100 kilometers per hour. Now having zero blackout between each and every frame just helps me maintain an accurate pan as these bikes pass me by. I'm getting very little rolling shutter when doing this. As you zoom in to 100% off that previous image, you're seeing no rolling shutter. The A9 Mark III has zero rolling shutter because it's a global shutter sensor. But even on the faster scan rate of the stack sensors, we can use this to capture rapidly moving subjects and not have shutter distortion interfering with the shots. So let's take a look at how Sony resolved the issues of rolling shutter way back in 2017 using their stacked Exmor RS sensors. As you can see there, a conventional camera capturing a golf swing and the new stack sensor technology there on the right. So as the years have moved on, we now have 50 megapixel versions of that original 24 megapixel stack sensor, and this has come with no compromise on that dynamic range. Now the A7R5 probably has the best dynamic range at ISO 100, but this A1M Mark II and also the A1 can better that dynamic range at ISO 500, which is the second sweet spot of this particular sensor, as independently tested by photons2photos.net there. As we zoom in, we can see rich full detail. This is captured in full sunlight, so the contrast is quite severe here. Now we've got a petrol tank painted white in full sun, and we've also got the black carbon fiber, both exhibiting full rich detail as we go through that detail, looking for possible crushed blacks or overexposed highlights. You'll see none in this particular example. Of course, resolution is king for the A1M Mark II over and above the A9 II cameras and also the A9 III for that matter. This is especially important if we want that resolution for 8K monitors or to create ginormous prints. If you were fortunate to be able to view this particular image on an 8K monitor, then you'd be seeing this level of detail, which is absolutely jaw-dropping in my books. Again, the extra resolution above an A9 camera is that ability to crop in post and still have plenty of megapixels. This is a 1.5 times crop that you'd get by shooting in APS-C mode, or alternatively, just cropping in post-production, you still end up with 21 megapixels. So that is especially useful, and as you can see, there'll be no loss of detail by cropping that much with these particular sensors here. Now that flexibility to crop gave me the ability, or in fact the idea, that I could possibly shoot this whole MotoGP that I've shot in previous years with just one lens plus teleconverters, one lens to cover them all. So I'm going to be shooting at different vantage points. I arrive at a vantage point early, and in the Moto 2 class I see this guy coming over the brow of the hill at Lukey Heights. I haven't yet had time to weigh up whether I need a teleconverter for this particular angle of view. I see a rider coming over the hill using a very unusual riding stance for this part of the circuit. Riders don't normally get this far out of the seat. So I haven't had time to put on a teleconverter yet, so if this rider probably will never do this during the whole 3-day event. So in this instance, I've simply just cropped in. This is a 2.25 times crop, so you're still seeing a 4K resolution rich image, but that's giving me a 675mm full frame equivalent angle of view, and you can see we still have excellent detail even though I've cropped so tightly. Now, if I don't need to crop, here's the 300mm prime GM lens at the corner called Siberia. It's one of my favorite corners because you can get this looking down vantage point. So you can almost imagine what it would be like to ride one of these 350 km/h bikes here. So this would give me the 8K crop from the resolution that I've got there. And this is Jorge Martin, one of the fastest guys on the planet, nicknamed the Martinator. I got that slight movement drag on the track there, which makes you fully appreciate that this bike is traveling at great speed. So this was captured at 1/250th of a second shutter speed here. Still getting really good accurate detail, and again I do need the stack sensor of the Alpha 1, Alpha 1.2 cameras to pan this accurately and this easily. So this is a different corner. Again, I need to thank Dorna for giving me one of the vests that you can only use to record certain parts of the track. This is the approach to turn 11 on the Phillip Island circuit. Now, I particularly wanted this vantage point because of that dark background. There's no advertising behind this rider, so that really makes the rider pop on this particular image. Now, I'm a little bit further away. The bikes are also traveling a little bit faster than in Siberia, so the average approximate speed now is going to be in excess of 130 km/h. So I'm getting the good framing here, the angle of view. We're using a 1.4 times teleconverter, which pushes out the focal length of this particular combination to 420mm. So I'm still pulling the 8K resolution when needed. But now I'm turning the camera back towards the exit of corner 10, so the bikes are much further away from me. So now I put on a 2 times teleconverter. I'm still getting that 8K resolution with a 600mm focal length with this particular combination. Even with the 2 times teleconverter, this 300 GM performs really well with both teleconverters, not just the 1.4 times. Now I'm on a different part of the circuit now. This is the exit of turn 11, not the entrance, and across the track in between races to get this particular angle of view. So I'm using the 300mm with a 2 times teleconverter, and I'm also doing an aggressive APS-C 1.5 times crop in post-production. So I'm getting a 900mm full frame equivalent angle of view with that combination. I've shot this on previous years using a 400 GM and a 1.4 teleconverter, and I've actually got a $6,000 saving by using this particular combination. Now that is pretty close to the price point of the Alpha 1 Mark II camera, so you can see why I really like this combination that I'm shooting with this particular year. There's another part of the circuit, Lukey Heights. This time they've come over Lukey Heights. Now I'm slightly lower down the hill, so the bikes are just appearing in the flash of a second. I can't see the bikes approaching the corner, as you can see in the inset image on the top right. That's how I first see the image, and then I have to quickly match the panning speed of my camera lens with the speed of the bike as it's accelerating. Now I don't shoot motorsports for a living. I just shoot it once a year, so I'm lucky to get the bike in the frame and then try and keep that bike in the same part of the frame. Now I've acquired the bike a little bit early in this instance, so I'm not going to try and readjust the framing as I'm panning. I'll just try and keep the bike over this side of the frame and then crop in post-production. So instead of using teleconverters and getting an 8K file, now I've got the flexibility of reframing in post-production and still giving me a really crisp 4K image. So in this particular instance, maybe a few bikes further along, I'm a bit late in acquiring this bike now, but again trying to keep the bike in the same part of the frame, reframing in post-production editing. Now, the other cameras that I saw in the media center that are shooting this type of sport was the Sony Alpha 1 cameras. Several guys on the MotoGP circuit now shoot with the Alpha 1 and GM lenses. But I also saw some Canon R5 Mark IIs and also some Nikon Z9s. These all feature stack sensors. So this is also giving the users of these cameras the ability to pan accurately or more easily than cameras with conventional sensors. It has to be said that how the Alpha 1 Mark II now stacks up against the Canon R5 Mark II and Nikon Z9 is exceptionally well, especially with the addition of the pre-release capture, which the other two models had and the Alpha 1 didn't. But my money now would go on the Sony Alpha 1 simply because we've got that much higher resolution viewfinder and also a higher resolution sensor, plus all of the bells and whistles of dual CF Express cards and the 30 frames per second with AF tracking. And this betters the features seen on the Canon R5 and Nikon Z9 cameras. 10 reasons to upgrade to an Alpha 1 Mark II. There are going to be many other new features of this camera, but even if I rattle on for an hour, I'm not going to have time to cover them all. Some people will say this is a minor upgrade, but I beg to disagree here. We now have AI subject recognition, including improved bird recognition by approximately 50% over an Alpha 1. Now, for many bird photographers or wildlife photographers, this is reason enough to put your money down on one of these cameras. Sports photographers, especially shooting bat ball sports, they're definitely going to be interested in that pre-capture, speed boost, and improved buffering. Again, many sports photographers would just go on to line item 2 there. We've got improved Steadyshot, not a minor improvement from 5 steps to 8.5 steps, which is class-leading stabilization. Got 30 frames per second with AF tracking. A lot of Alpha 1 owners didn't realize that if you selected an AF tracking focus area, the camera wouldn't be hitting the 30, it would hit a maximum of 20 frames per second. So the only way of getting the full 30 frames was to not use an AF tracking area. So now when we don't have that compromise, it's 30 frames per second with any AF tracking focus area, as long as you're shooting in compressed RAW, JPEG, or the HIF file formats. We've got that excellent 4-axis multi-angle monitor, so it doesn't matter whether you're shooting in vertical orientation or landscape orientation, you are going to get the angle of view on that monitor that you actually want. We've got the Still Movie S&Q dial, which is going to be a godsend for people who like to recall registered settings on the memory recall dial. You can have 3 for stills, 3 for movies, 3 for S&Q, and 3 more for time-lapse movies, which is another new feature of the Alpha 1 Mark II over the Alpha 1 camera. We've got the ability to change the drive mode, not just from the drive mode dial on the top left of the camera, but also from the right side of the camera, the control wheel, or from a menu item. Very important when you're holding one of the big 400 or 600 GM lenses aloft that you can change your mind on the number of frames per second without having to come and pull your left hand holding the lens up back to the body of the camera. We've got improved auto white balance and high ISO noise performance, really big items for maybe JPEG and HEIF shooters. Dynamic active steady shot for movies is going to be really important for the videographers. Plus also, I haven't listed it there, but also the AI subject recognition for birds and animals in when shooting movies as well. So let's take a closer look at pre-capture, speed boost, and improved buffering. It's probably, I reckon, probably a 10% increase on that improved buffering. So that's not the real biggie here. It's really the pre-capture and speed boost. The speed boost can be accessed by default by just pressing the C5. So you could be shooting 5 frames per second. Something unexpected happens. Maybe a rider crashes mid-bend and suddenly you realize you need to be shooting this in 30 frames per second, not 5 frames per second. Simply depress the C5 key and you'll get that speed boost there. Perhaps the big one, however, is the pre-capture. I'm using usually 0.4 to 0.5 seconds. It does extend all of the way up to 1 second. My delay in pressing the shutter release is usually a quarter of a second to a third of a second in most instances, so I don't need the full 1 second there. I'm not a back button AF shooter, so I've got the pre-capture start triggering linked to both the AF on button and also half depressing the shutter release button there. Now, this was actually captured with the A9 III, which I first encountered the pre-capture. So I didn't do any bat ball sports in this particular review period, but you can see that you're pretty much always guaranteed of getting the ball in the frame, maybe multiple frames with the ball in the frame with pre-capture. Okay, you're never going to miss that decisive moment shot, the money shot. So for me, I was able to test the pre-capture to good outcomes with birds in this particular review period. And as I said, my reaction time is approximately a third of a second too slow. So I'm looking for the parent bird to be incoming. Now these are fast birds, they're swallows, so they're not slow on the wing here. But by the time I figure that the parent has arrived, it's almost too late. The decisive moment has been and gone. So, but I am using the pre-capture, so I will have the decisive moment in the buffer before I fully depress the shutter release. And here is the shot that I actually wanted. Incoming bird, parent carrying insect for the gaping mouth of the baby bird there. At the front of that stack, as you see when I actually press that shutter release, the camera very nicely put a little star rating on the time when I actually press the shutter release, but the one that I want is in the buffer, it's in the pre-capture stage. So I go back in time, pull out the decisive moment, and there's my hero shot there. A great feature, I think, for a lot of photographers. And just one more look at the welcome swallows on the wing there. And that wasn't just one lucky shot. I spent a good 30 minutes watching this baby bird being fed, and with the parent or probably two parents coming in with the breakfast. All of those shots, by the way, were captured at ISO 8000. It was in the very early light of the day. So again, the high ISO performance really serving me well. Now, another thing that people will probably want for this is maybe birds taking off. Certainly with the larger birds, which are slower to get onto the wing, and especially moving left to right, you're going to get a good success rate. With things like that are coming towards the camera, you're probably going to get less of a success rate. Maybe I wasn't using the absolute optimum settings, but certainly the larger winged birds, I got a good hit rate of sharp images as the bird's taking flight using that pre-capture feature there. Changing the drive mode from the top dial or from my menu. As you can see here, I'm holding a 400 GM from last year's MotoGP Aloft. If I want to slow down from 5 or 10 or move faster to 30 frames per second, I can do that without lowering the lens now, because I can make those adjustments from having it programmed to the left side of the control wheel. So long as I move that drive mode dial to that little star position, I'll get the settings that I want. Improved auto white balance when I'm doing testing these pre-production cameras. I can't open the raw files, so the improved auto white balance and also the high ISO noise performance were good features for me shooting in JPEG or the HEIF file format here. So I can best showcase the accuracy of the auto white balance by just pointing the camera at things with very strong primary colors, which are usually the reasons the auto white balance tends to get things wrong. So let's take a look at some really strong colors, and I haven't really adjusted the auto white balance in post-production. Just shows you how accurate the camera is at getting skin tones, even though dominant colors keep on appearing in the frame. It doesn't skew the auto white balance from doing the job in hand. Here's Ducati's team manager Davide Tardozzi on the grid. Again, another thank you for Dorna for giving me that vest to allow me to get onto the grid during this decisive moment just before the MotoGP starts. So another grid girl and the police who are making sure that people don't get onto the grid who shouldn't be on the grid. And again, more big primary colours. This is the current world champion, Pecco Bagnaia, moving up to the start of the grid position. He'll be on row 1, of course, because he's one of the quickest guys on the planet. And here's Alex Marquez. All of those colours don't stop the camera from doing the job in hand, which is to render good skin tones. And some of the riders, Alex Rins on the grid, and Fabio Giantonio on the grid, and Pecco Bagnaia coming to start the race. Let's take a look at ISO noise performance, especially important again if it's being done in camera. I've got the Alpha 1 on the left, Alpha 1 Mark II on the right. Let's push that ISO up to 10,000. We're using a 7200 at 121 millimeters, and I'm using a 1/125th of a second. So that 10,000 is pretty much the sort of things you're going to get after sunset. And let's take a look at 100% magnification side by side. I'm seeing a one-stop clear advantage on the right side, which just happens to be the Alpha 1 Mark II camera. If you're having trouble viewing it on your monitor, let's zoom in to 200%. I think you can probably work out which has got the smallest noise there, and obviously the Alpha 1 too. Again, I think it's probably a one-stop advantage, which is not insignificant. So at ISO 10,000, if you don't want to do any post-production noise reduction, I think 10,000 holds up pretty well, unless you zoom in, and then you might want to do that noise reduction. Improved Steadyshot. I'm going to use that same vantage point to highlight this, but let's first call out it's not a minor upgrade. Okay, so some people might be saying this is a minor upgrade of camera, but this is from 5 steps to 8.5 steps. So instead of shooting that previous shot at ISO 10,000, this time I've put on a 135 prime, and I'm lowering the ISO to 100. I'm not using auto ISO and letting the ISO climb to what it needs to climb. I'm lowering it, and this will force the shutter speed to lengthen. 0.5 seconds on a 135 prime handheld. How sharp is that? 100% magnification. I think we can all agree that it's doing an excellent job. And this wasn't one from a group of 10 shots that were sharp. I think 8 or 9 of the 10 were sharp at 0.5 seconds. Going down to a much wider 28 millimeters, I'm getting a little bit adventurous now. I don't have an ND filter for this lens, and I also don't have a tripod, but I want to smooth the water by using a long exposure. So I'm going for 2 seconds. I think I've stopped down to f22, and which I know landscape photographers don't want to do, but if you've forgotten your tripod and you want to smooth the water, then it's ISO 50, f16, f22, and here's the 2-second exposure. How sharp at 100%? Sharp enough, I think. So again, some good outcomes here from the improved Steadyshot. There is one more way of handling that city scene here. We tried leaving the ISO at 10,000. We tried putting the shutter speed down to 0.5 seconds. Here's another option available to Alpha 1 Mark II, and that is to do Composite Raw shooting. A new feature for the Alpha 9 III and Alpha 1 Mark II is noise reduction shooting, or NR shooting. Now you can choose 4, 8, 16 or 32 shots. I've chosen 8 shots at 12,800. I go into the free Sony Imaging Edge desktop application, the viewer, and now I will choose Composite Raw Shooting from that menu there. And let's see how it does. Okay, well, it cleans up the image, not perhaps completely. Still looks like an ISO 800 image to me at 100%, but pretty damn good. Then you don't need to be using a tripod for this. These are handheld shots. But I'm not too sure how much movement this feature can deal with, but certainly handheld, it's working and dealing with that sufficiently in my books. Now, I'd have to say that if you own AI noise reduction software, such as made by Topaz, then maybe you'd just be tempted just to process one of those files rather than doing the composite shooting feature in the camera. AI subject recognition, let's go back to that feature. Subject recognition is powered by an artificial intelligence chip. So the Alpha 1 users who perhaps wanted the feature when they saw it arrive with the Alpha 7R5 I unfortunately had to tell them, well, it's being driven not by firmware, but by an AA processing unit. So you would need to do open heart surgery on the camera in order to insert this and wire it to the motherboard in order to get this feature. So this is not a minor upgrade to this camera. This is hardware modification to the existing A1 camera. So that auto, we saw it on the Alpha 9 III, the ability not just to switch between birds and animals, but also birds, animal, and humans. But you might be fooled into thinking it's just switching between those three, when in fact, the auto, it's switching between all of them. Obviously, we couldn't crowd them all onto the icon. So we are getting the camera deciding when to switch between insects, birds, animals, humans, cars, trains, and planes. So just a call out there, just in case one of the other reviewers misses that point, it is basically working with all of those subjects. Now I'm using the Imaging Edge desktop app here to show you where the focus point is. So it's showing you actually that the AI subject recognition is using the car train algorithm, even though it's in auto subject recognition here. So when at certain angles of that motorcycle, I know it's car train, but it's also good for boats and motorcycles and bicycles as well in my experience. But occasionally it's going to recognize that there is a human aboard that vehicle, and suddenly it wants to then prioritize the human over the motorcycle. So not only has it found the human and the head of the human, but it's also locating the eye in that head if the helmet wasn't on that rider's head. Pretty amazing, I think, and that is the AI subject recognition at work. You probably have no problem with using IAF on an Alpha 1 behind shaded glasses, but I just wanted to go for the mirrored glasses just to make sure that there is no eye visible at all, and also in shade, mirrored sunglasses underneath a peak cap, still doing its job nicely. Profile view of a rider with objects passing in front, still getting that eye behind the sunglasses there. Eye behind dark visors, not a problem. Eyes on mostly obscured people in profile view. Now we're getting somewhere where I think the Alpha 1 would struggle. In fact, any camera that doesn't have these AI subject recognition chips. So this is something that some photographers will think is worth of the upgrade. One more final example, a rider mostly turned away is actually getting weighed after a race. I'm not too sure what the purpose of that is, but where basically the camera is tracking the position of the eye even though the head is turned away from the camera with a helmet on. Now, as I said, it's got that auto switching, so if your animal is dressed up as a human, it's not really going to have an issue there. Dogs dressed up as sunflowers, still not an issue. Where it might auto switch to human is if that human in the top left of the frame becomes any bigger in that frame, the camera will go, oh, I think I prefer the human over the animal, and that is something that happens with the auto mode. It will favor humans over animals. So if the animal is definitely the hero, you have to manually switch out of the auto mode and go down into animal or animal bird in order for the camera to disregard the humans in the image. Improved bird recognition, which is part of that AI subject recognition. Now, Sony are quoting 50% better. I'm not too sure how they arrive at these figures, but I'm going to have to say that bird recognition is certainly working out for me in this particular review period. Even when flapping wings are coming in front of the face, the camera is doggedly holding eye onto the eye position. So even if you've got that locked on subject recognition, it's going to allow the wing to conceal the eye for a fraction of a second and then pull back to the eye when that wing moves away from that head. It's basically always knowing where the head of the bird is. Also with birds that are in trees or behind foliage, behind branches, again, that's going to be another great feature. So you don't always have to choose the smallest spot. You can sometimes get away with a larger focus area, and the camera is sufficiently aware that the leaf is not what it should be going for. It should be going for the bird. Okay, so this is sort of a side issue to the review, but I just wanted to, for those people who were interested in seeing those MotoGP images shot at the Australian MotoGP on Phillip Island, I worked out that I was going to shoot this on the 300mm lens by having last year shot some of the corners, not with the 400, but coming with slightly wider using 300mm focal length, either using a 7200 in APS-C mode or using a 1.4 teleconverter on a 7200. So that's how I was getting this particular angle of view for some of the vantage points on the circuit. So I decided just to showcase how light I could go with the 300 GM and both the 1.4 and 2 times teleconverters. Now, if I'm using an A1M2 and 300 GM plus teleconverters, I'm running at 2.1 kilograms lighter than a Nikon Z9 and Nikkor 300mm. And when you've got this camera at arm's length for 3 days, and I'm not using a monopod because I just find that the panning just becomes overly complicated with monopods, this 2 kilogram saving is definitely worth having, in my opinion. But otherwise I'd need to go to the gym and work out with my left arm a little bit more than I currently do. So that 300 GM, it looks a chunky lens, but it's actually coming in at half a kilo lighter, even with that 2 times teleconverter on. So it's definitely the lightweight alternative. And even if putting that 2 times teleconverter, you're still shooting at an f5.6 aperture, which is still a third of a stop brighter than that 200-600 at f6.3. I'm using aperture priority and ISO auto minimum shutter speed set to 1/250th of a second. I'm having to adjust the aperture periodically as the ambient light changes, just so I make sure that the shutter speed is around that 1/250th of a second, because I'm not using manual exposure mode, I'm using aperture priority mode. So I will need to adjust the aperture and keep an eye on that 1/250th of a second. And just make sure that I don't accidentally overexpose some of the brightest highlights when the sunshine comes out. So that's the reason I'm using aperture priority. And I will go over that in my ebook and support on my support channel. Also remembering to switch the Steadyshot mode on the lens to Steadyshot mode 2, because most of the 3 days is panning left to right or right to left. So the reason I'm shooting with those slower shutter speeds, so I'm getting that beautiful movement drag behind the speeding motorcycles. Does mean you need accurate panning, but the accurate panning is far easier when using a stack sensor or the global shutter sensor of the A9 III. You could shoot this at a very fast shutter speed, 1/2000th of a second, if the camera's hardly moving because you're shooting at the apex of the hairpin. You could possibly shoot this at 1/2000th of a second, but you still get a little bit more pop by even slowing the shutter speed down, even in those tight corners, as evidenced by Marc Marquez coming through this turn 11 at 1/500th of a second shutter speed. And didn't need to show you another image, but this is the Australian rider Jack Miller. And again, we zoom in just to marvel at the detail we get on a 50 megapixel sensor, zoomed in as if we're viewing now in an 8K monitor or a very large print. Now, one of the other things that I'm switching from previous years is I've stopped using the JPEG file format and I've switched over to the HEIF or HIF, also known as HEIC or HEIC, which is Apple's wording for this particular file format, and C stands for container instead of format. Now we got the option to shoot in 4:2:2 color, so I'm getting a little bit more color depth by choosing this format over JPEG. Now, the other advantage of shooting with this file format is I'm getting over 8,500 images on a 128 gigabyte card at full resolution, and that's compared to just over 4,500 using extra fine JPEG file format. Now, the HEIF file format is supported by Lightroom, but most web browsers don't yet support it. Google Chrome will support it with a plugin. Apple's Safari web browser does support it natively. Now, so that does mean if you're shooting in this file format, you're not going to upload them directly to the website. You are going to convert them to JPEGs before. You will need to go and use the switch from JPEG to HEIF if you want to work with this file format. And in the image quality settings, you'll need to double check that you've got extra fine, not just fine, selected as your file format of choice. I'm shooting with RAW onto slot 2, but I haven't been able to access these RAW files yet because it's a pre-production camera. Now, I do go over all of my settings in my 700-page ebook for this particular camera, which you can download now from my Alpha support channel. Now, I cover a whole range of areas of this camera. I don't go through every feature one by one that they're listed in the menus. I go into groups of settings that are appropriate to shoot certain things. So this is a real-world approach to shooting. I also have 56 links to supporting videos which further expand on the topics. And as I said, it does focus on camera setup, and that camera setup is supported by a camera setup file which you can download. You can set up your entire camera in just 1 minute from that file placed onto a memory card on slot 1. So you can set up the camera as outlined in the ebook, or you can just use my camera setup file and then know how the camera is set up by just viewing the tables of settings. And this will go into rich detail about my preferred settings, not just for the memory recalls, but also for the custom keys, the FN menus, the recall custom hold settings there. And I do have the opportunity in my ebooks to go into a lot of detail, something that I often don't have get time to go into even these long 1-hour reviews of these movies. So you can catch up with me on this support channel at patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. Ebooks, Q&A forums for the Premium Plus members, member-only seminars. These are 1 and 2 hour movies about various topics of photography, such as travel photography, etc. I do make available all of the raw files from my camera and lens reviews, and also the camset files for all of the late model cameras. Coming back to the review of this camera, so the movie shooters will also get significant upgrades by moving up to an Alpha-1.2. So I've listed them all here, what's supported by the Alpha-1.2 that's not supported by the Alpha-1. Subject recognition in movie shooting might be a big one for maybe photographers doing video files or movie files of birds in flight. They want that subject recognition not just with humans but also the birds as well. But we've got all of the bells and whistles here: auto framing, dynamic active steady shot, which will make the camera look like it's on a gimbal even though you're just hand holding the camera, framing stabilizer, focus map, still images from shot marks. Let's look at some of the changes to the menus. So we've got bulb timer, which we've seen on the late model cameras released last year. We've got that noise reduction shooting setting, which first appeared on the Alpha 9 III. We've got preset focus zoom. So if you're using a Sony lens, you don't need to be using a 400 or 600 GM lens now to access that feature. It's a feature where you can just press a button and the focus automatically returns to a set memory save point, which might be the branch on a tree for a bird photographer or the corner on a track for a sports photographer. So that is a really useful feature. Full-time DMF, that was only available on premium GM lenses, but now on all of Sony lenses, that full-time DMF does allow you to quickly turn the focus ring in autofocus mode and then let the autofocus take on when you're much closer to the subject, rather than letting a long telephoto lens track very slowly trying to find where the subject is because everything is so out of focus. You just pull the focus with a 1-second twist of the focus ring and then let the autofocus fine-tune that. We've got new focus areas, so an extra large or a small, which we can move around the screen. We've also got these very useful custom focus areas. So if your wildlife is just on the horizon line or just above the tall grass, we can basically create a focus area which excludes all of the foreground, just in case there's any false subject recognition and the camera mistakes part of the undergrowth or grass for maybe a face. So you basically exclude that from the AI subject recognition area and just focus on everything that appears above the tall grass, or maybe in a track situation such as I encountered at the MotoGP. We have those 12, we get to choose what appears in this 12 options in the function menu, accessed by quickly pressing the FN button on the back of the camera. We can have 12 for stills, 12 for movies, but now we can also have 12 for the playback menu as well. And we can filter what we want to be played back, whether it's still images or movies, or whether we just want to view the image that we've rated on the camera. We've got release lag start time. So this will basically fine tune so we never miss the decisive moment if we're trying to work without the pre-capture. Now, fast release might be great for people who are trying to sync their timing of their shutter release with the bird basically taking flight, but I think I'd possibly just do this using the pre-capture because of my own quarter to a third of a second delayed reaction to what I see happening in front of me. So we've got white balance capture frame size, which may not be so important if you're not creating custom white balances because you found the auto white balance so reliable now. We got some naming change here from older alpha cameras. The AF tracking sensitivity changes to AF level for crossing, and we've also got the AF track speed change, which is a new menu item there. So instead of tracking sensitivity 1 locked on, 5 responsive, often people tracking somebody with a ball, running with a ball, you want locked on so it doesn't jump to another player. That would be responsive action. But some people will want to jump if their subject gets obscured. They don't want any delay in jumping to the new subject that now appears closer to the frame. So there will be a reason that many photographers will want to move between those 5 options. And the AF tracking for speed change, again, responsive. It may be good for, again, bird photographers looking for the moment when the distance changes very, very quickly, suddenly. And that responsive is going to be the best for maybe a small bird leaving the branch of a tree. Changes to the body design. Some people will think that Sony have used the same body because it looks a little bit similar, but it's a completely different body. It's wider, it's deeper, and we'll look at some of the reasons for maybe why it's wider. As you can see, it's grown from 2.74 inches thick to 3.3 inches. That comes, I think, courtesy of the improved Steadyshot. We're wider on the side dimension as well, and that is predominantly because of that C5 button on the front of the camera. Now you'll notice that it's that little movie capture button has moved further away from the finder, so you can see there's a little bit more room on the back, but it's the room on the front which is the most significant, not only because the C5 custom button is there, but it also gives you more room for your knuckles when putting on some of the really fat big GM lenses onto that. You're not going to be rubbing your knuckles on the side of that lens anymore. Got the 4-axis multi-angle monitor we first saw on the Alpha 7R5. Very difficult to think of a camera position where you're not going to be able to view the scene that you want to view on that monitor by using all 4 axes of that monitor. Possibly one of the best monitors out there on the planet. Small point, the angle of the shutter release is now slightly different from the Alpha 1. We saw this change on the Alpha 9.3, and that's been taken across to the Alpha 1.2. Again, important for people shooting maybe action sports for many days in a row. Here's the C5 button. It is by default programmed for the burst speed, as we can move from 5 to 30 just by pressing that button, but you could assign it to another function if you wished. There's that symbol on the drive mode dial. This is especially useful for me because I like to recall my registered groups of settings, which I also share with my patrons on patreon.com. If you put the drive mode dial in that position, so if you're bringing back a memory recall, instead of working with maybe a drive mode in a few frames per second, which would be suitable for maybe shooting portraits, if I move the shoot mode dial, memory dial to memory recall 2, which is my action settings, I'm going to go into the 20 frames per second. I don't need to basically be moving that dial as I change the memory recalls on the right side of the camera. Because the body has changed in almost every dimension, we do have a new vertical grip for the new Alpha Mark II, which I suspect also is the same grip that appears for the Alpha 9 III. If we open all of the doors on the left side of the camera, you will see that there's been some reconfiguration. Apparently there was a request by a lot of videographers for the HDMI port to go onto the bottom corner of the camera, so Sony has obliged there. The X-Sync port has also moved to the bottom, and the micro HDMI port has moved further up the camera there. The deactivated drive mode we've talked about, the Stills Movie S&Q, really great for increasing the number of registered memories. So we can now have 3 for movies and 3 for stills. We don't have to share those 3 between those two. We've got 3 more for slow and quick, or S&Q, and we've even got 3 additional ones. When we move the dial to S&Q, the camera will ask us whether we want S&Q or we want to do time-lapse movies. So we'll have 3 more for time-lapse movies as well. That's 12 registered memories on the camera. We don't have to be putting additional memories onto the memory cards anymore. So voice memo microphone. So obviously the Alpha 1 Mark II, we can basically call out to the camera, this is player so-and-so, or if we've been told the name of a bird we haven't photographed before, we can just speak into the back of the camera and have that recorded for later use. So the microphone now is in a really useful place when you're talking to the back of the camera. Concluding remarks, Alpha 1.2 or Alpha 9.3. I think that really comes down to frames per second, to be honest. If you take a look at this image that I captured with the Alpha 9.3, I've composited the layers here. There's about 22 or more layers here, and these have all been captured in the space of 0.2 seconds on the pre-capture. So you can see that if a decisive moment in something that has some action that is happening in a really fraction of a second, the ability to cherry pick which image that you want from that burst is going to be, you're going to get more options with an Alpha 9.3 than an Alpha 1.2. You're going to get basically a quarter of the amount of frames in the pre-capture buffer with the Alpha 1.2. So if you're looking to capture frames where you always get a bullet leaving the barrel of a gun, then I would definitely move towards an Alpha 9.3 rather than trial and error using an Alpha 1 Mark II. So one of the great things about a global shutter sensor, which is a step above and beyond the stack sensors we're using in the Alpha 1 cameras, is the ability to sync flash at any shutter speed. So this was shot at a triathlon event with an Alpha 9.3, and I'm using a 1/8000th of a second sync speed. So I can really darken off that sunny background behind this swimmer exiting the water in this particular instance. But if you need that flexibility, and we looked at that in my shots of the MotoGP, if I'm covering the event from multiple corners using one lens and the ability to zoom in post, then it's going to be the Alpha 1 or Alpha 1 Mark II, just because that 2.25 times crop does give me huge flexibility when covering events. So Alpha 1 or Alpha 1.2, I think it comes down in my books to 2 main features. One is that pre-capture, the ability to always have the hero moment in the buffer, even if your reaction time is a little bit slow. And let's move over to the AI subject recognition, which is the second major feature. And obviously that's not going to come in with a firmware upgrade to the original Alpha 1 Mark II, because it's a piece of hardware upgrade, not a firmware upgrade. And that will give you access to that feature I've covered in this review. Some people will say, well, how much better is an Alpha 1 or an Alpha 1 Mark II over an Alpha 7R5? Now, it's a difficult conversation to have with the original Alpha 1, because the Alpha 7R5 has got the subject recognition, whereas the Alpha 1 doesn't. It becomes a little bit easier to explain when we have an Alpha 1 Mark II. Because if you're working with very rapidly moving subjects, sports, action, birds in flight, the Alpha 1.2 will give you a much higher hit rate. Okay, so that would be my advice there. So if you're panning the camera, vehicles traveling at in excess of 100 kilometers per hour, or you're trying to gauge a decisive moment with a bird taking off, you are going to get benefits from using that Alpha 1 Mark II as outlined in this review. Now I've got some big comparison charts here. It's a lot to go into, so you might just want to pause the movie, take a look. Obviously the ticks are the highlights and the reds are the ones where, can you live with that slightly lower performance spec there? Like I put the stack sensor on the Alpha 7R5 as a no, just to show that you don't have that blackout free shooting. But a big positive point of the Alpha 7R5, if it's the cheapest one of these options. You do have a very high resolution sensor and you do have AI subject recognition. But then it quickly moves over to the right side of the board here. The Alpha 9 III pretty much gets a check against for everything except the lower resolution. So if you're looking for higher resolution, it's really then, do you choose the Alpha 1 or the Alpha 1 II? And then it comes down to the AI subject recognition and pre-capture, which I've highlighted perhaps are the two most important things you would want to upgrade to the Alpha 1 II. Now you look at the prices on the top, the Alpha 1 actually is listed at a higher price point than the Alpha 1 Mark II. Now expect that A1 to be discounted as soon as you start watching this movie. I expect that Alpha 1 will probably have creep in at under $6,000. So that might now be a comparable price with the Alpha 9 III. Now, one of the things on the Alpha 9 III that's a slightly lower spec is the dynamic range. Now, the base ISO of the A9 III is 250, so we expect the dynamic range to be a little bit lower. I think it's sufficient for most sports action photographers, so not a huge thing that would dissuade you from buying an Alpha 9 III, but I do need to list it because it's the Alpha 1 sensors is 1 1/3 stops better dynamic range. Probably not so much at raised ISO. It gets a little bit more of a level playing field at maybe when we're comparing the Alpha 9 III at ISO 800, which is its second sweet spot, and the Alpha 1 II at ISO 500. So we're down to like a 1 stop difference in dynamic range there now. Alpha 1, again, just list some of the downsides on the body there. No stills, movies, and S&Q dial. We don't have that lockout option for the drive mode on, that little star that allows us to recover registered drive modes from registered memories. We don't have that 4-axis multi-angle monitor, and the monitor on the original Alpha 1 is not as high resolution as the latest model full-frame Alpha cameras. Movies, okay, so looking at the difference in movie specs, basically we're getting much better movie specs on pretty much all of the 3 later model cameras. We do get rolling shutter and we don't get the 4K 120p on the Alpha 7R5, and we don't get 8K on the Alpha 9 III. But pretty much everything you can see there is leaning towards the Alpha 1 II. Again, we've got a 10% limited crop, which I don't think is a very heavy crop when shooting in 4K 120p. And the rolling shutter is not going to be 0, but it will hardly be noticeable on the Alpha 1 II compared to the Alpha 9 III, which has 0 rolling shutter. That concludes my review of the Alpha 1 Mark II. Hopefully that will give you some idea that it's not really a minor upgrade, as some reviewers will undoubtedly point out to you. I think maybe some people will want in global shutter sense, but it's enough of an upgrade to showcase that we're getting the best of some of the late model cameras with some of the unique advantages of using an Alpha 1 camera as well. So if you want ongoing support, remember to go to patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. Remember, when you subscribe, there's no contracts or commitments, so you can subscribe for as little as 1 month, and that is $10. So you will be able to download multiple ebooks, not just the ebook for your camera, but additional ebooks on topics of photography. We've got Q&A forums for Premium Plus members. We've got the member-only seminars, dozens of 1 and 2 hour movies on various topics. We've got raw files from my camera and lens reviews. We've got editing workshops as well, where I will make available the raw files that are used to demonstrate my post-production editing workflows, and also the camset files, which are the camera setup files. So you can set up the entire camera as outlined in the ebook in just a minute or two. And there's a quick overview of just most of the ebooks that I have for late model cameras. It's really started with the Alpha 7 III, A7R3, and I've gone through to most cameras, perhaps except for the A7S III. I've now got them covered there. And there's an overview of some of the many 1 and 2 hour seminars, the 1 and 2 hour movies that I also make available for my patrons. Okay, so I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Just give me the thumbs up. Just remember to subscribe for future reviews, and I'll catch you online next time.